This is the Monome Norns shield, and this is a DIY project. I didn't build it, I got it from a builder. So for today's video we're going to go through mapping parameters. We're going to use the Awake app, which is what's playing at the moment. Now Awake is a dual sequencer, so you have an upper row and a lower row, and you set the steps for each by flipping the button here, so you can see, hopefully you can see, it's a bit bright here today I'm afraid. You can see a little cursor jump from the top row to the bottom row. So that's the idea there. And then you use the second knob here to move the cursor along for each step, and then the third knob, which is this one here. So this is knob 1, 2, 3. So you move the third one to adjust the pitch. Now the dual sequencer aspect means that the second sequencer, the lower one, whatever pitches we have here are then added to wherever they occur with a particular step in the top row. Now, one of the things that is really good about this dual sequencer is that, or this dual sequencer approach, is that you can have unequal step lengths. So this step length is 8 for the top row, and it's 7, if I can see it, it's a bit bright, but it's 7, I think it's 7, in the lower row. So by swapping through the different pages, you can change the loop length. So here, this third knob changes the loop length for the lower sequencer. So now it just has a step of 1, 2 steps, 3. So the really interesting aspects of this that come forward are really where you have unequal step lengths or non-complementary step lengths. So if you had 8 at the top and 2 at the bottom, then it always kind of cycles around in pretty much the same way. Whereas when you have 8 and 3, as we have here, then it starts to shift around. So 8 and 4 will become quite regular, quite predictable, quite quickly. So it's almost like it's kind of in like a freeze function. If you've ever used anything like a Turing machine, and then you press the freeze button, and then or you rotate the dial so that it then freezes the currently sort of data value at those particular points. But the moment you shift it either by 1 and make it 5, or 1 less and make it 3, you get these phasing patterns. So the value that's at step 1 here is moving around and then is added to the whatever the step value is at that point once they cycle against each other. I suppose the only the frustrating thing about all of this is that you have to keep sort of moving between pages to try to kind of do everything. So really what this video is about is mapping it using a controller like this, which is the 16N. You can use any controller. This is just 16 sliders, and you set their CC number, and then that's it. So it goes from 32, from number 32 upwards. So what we're going to look at is really sort of mapping some of these parameters so that we don't necessarily have to keep flipping pages. I mean, flipping the pages is not really a problem. You've got things like the sound, so you can change the filtering, which is great. And the gain, and so on. And then on the last page, we have the options. We can change the tempo, we can change the root, make it B flat. If you've seen some of my other videos, I prefer to call it B flat than A sharp, but there we go. You can also, for some of them, you can also switch through them as well. So when you hold the first button here, you can also change the subdivisions, eighth notes, and then you can also change the scale type. Let's go for major. I tend to like the Lydian one. There we go. Today is basically to just kind of walk you through the mapping using the 16N, and kind of avoiding flipping pages, basically, because obviously this is a very small interface. So you can imagine if you had a dedicated surface, it would be something a bit more sort of monolithic, and then probably not as flexible as the Norns is. One of the things, if you want to know some more about the inner workings of each of the apps, then I've got a few videos, and of course other practitioners have got similar sorts of videos and explorations going on. So I'd recommend, going and having a look at all of those. If you are watching this and you're interested in the Norns, I think it's a really good, very compact device, especially if you get the DIY kind of Shield version, which is this one. Obviously there's more expensive ones that you could buy if you want to go for that rather lovely ergonomic look that Monome has. But if that doesn't really bother you, then this is really good. And the software interfacing system, which is Maiden, works really well. I've done a little bit of coding, but not much, but other people are way better than me at doing that. And there's some great apps out there that you can try. And it plays well over MIDI sync. You've got OSC as well. It integrates in lots of different ways, and there's very little to sort of say why you shouldn't have one if you are this way inclined. Right, so let's have a look at the mapping. So when you're sort of going through the other sorts of pages, you have, let me have a look here. So you can see here as we get the menu system, so we've got select. So select means we can change the app. System, that's like stuff like if you want to connect to a Wi-Fi source. Sleep is when you want to put it to bed, as it were. And then when you move the first dial, you come to parameters. So we can edit the parameters. So this gives us a number of parameters we can go through. I'm just going to cycle through these. I'm not going to explain them all. Some of them are self-explanatory, like levels, reverb, compressor. Softcut is their sampling engine. Clocking, whether you want to do internal clock or having it with synchronized with other hardware kit. BPM, you've got the clock out. So the clock out can be, you can turn it on, off, depending if you want it to play with other things. It can interface with different other Monome modules, especially on the Euro rack like Crow, MIDI outputs. So it's pretty straightforward. And then we get to the stuff that is more, so that's kind of the global end of it. The more sort of app specific end is from here. So we can do step lengths, you can do the note length, you can do what scale. So it's at this point that we no longer need to look at the interface. Now, for some people, this is going to be enough because then you can just scroll up and down and sort of change things. But you can also have them under under a controller. So it's kind of going to vary from one person to the next. Let me take on the wrong one. Bring the volume down a little bit. So it's going to vary between sort of practitioners in terms of which ones you elect to go for. I like things like the pulse width, the way that sort of shapes the timbre. Bring it down. So as you can hear, so you get quite a rich sort of expressive range between all of these. So again, it's going to vary between all of us. Release, do you want it more percussive? Now you can hear much more of the delays and so on becoming much more prominent. So we might want to sort of map these sorts of things, as well as we might want to map the filter. So I figured we might do a few of those, and obviously volume. We might do delay time. I mean, I think there's stuff that we can do that's to do with the actual sequences itself. So like mapping the length of the sequencer. And you also have things like probabilities of a sequence happening. Let's see, there we are, we went past it. But the probability of an event actually taking place. And now this is global, it's not per step, but you know, so it's 50% of the time it will fire. We will definitely be here a while now. But you see, the thing is that what you've got here is that if you have the output set up, I mean, I didn't mention this earlier, but with the Monome Norns, you can have the outputs in terms of just purely audio, or just MIDI, or audio and MIDI. Now, sometimes, I mean, I've got a couple of videos where, I have a few videos where I'm doing that, and I'll put the link in the description below. But so what you can have is a combination of audio and MIDI. So you have the audio output from the Monome Norns, and then you have the MIDI going into something like Ableton, and then feeding another instrument like Operator. But what you also have here with the probability engine is that because it's sending out MIDI data, it means that you can have a sort of a probability-based sequence kind of coming out. Now, the problem with well, this isn't really a problem, but the main thing about the Awake is that you've got this dual step sequencer thing. So it's not a traditional step sequencer as comes with most sort of DAWs. And as long as you're happy sort of, with a maximum of 16 steps, and also whether you choose to use the dual sequencer part. So that means whether you choose to use the lower sequencer to actually adapt the upper values. You could create some really interesting sort of parts. And now these could be used just as much to trigger samples as they can be used to trigger notes. So it opens up a number of ways of looking at it. So there we go. So that's fun, isn't it? So let me scroll back up. So those are the parameters. Below that, below edit, we also have preset, which is preset, and then map. So map is basically our mapping of all of these different parameters. So this is where we use the 16N. So let's do the first one. Let's do amp. So when we click here, you can see we've got learn, clear, and then there are a number of parameters. So we could go in and edit some things if we want to, but first of all, we're going to put it into learning. And when we do the learning, it's waiting for MIDI input. So I've just moved the first slider, and you can hear now that that first slider is taking care of amplitude. And you can see it's mapped to CC32. And so now when we look at the various parameters here, we can see that the CC is 32, the range is 0 to 127, its MIDI channel is 1. You can see the output read at the top there. It's scaling. I mean, I'm not sure whether the scaling is really to do with Norns or is to do with my 16N, which was also a DIY build. But the scaling doesn't feel like one-to-one sort of ratio. It feels that there's something slightly different going on in there. And when I use this in Ableton, I tend to find that a similar kind of scaling takes place. Other than that, it works well. So most of the necessary information is there. So that's amplitude. So that's going to be on the first one. Let's say that we do pulse width. So again, the same thing. Sorry, this keeps moving around. I'm going to put it into learning. So I'm going to use the second fader. So that's now going to do pulse width. Let me bring the amp up. And you can hear that we're getting the change. So far so good. And that's kind of how simple it actually is to do. So let's do release, learning. I'm going to do the third fader. So now we can hear. We can go from very tight. So let's do cutoff. Fourth fader. I think you get the plan now. Did I put it into learn? There we go. So that's with the cutoff, bringing the pulse width up. So my first four faders are doing amplitude, pulse width, release, and filter. So fader 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me try and show that here. I've only got one camera at the moment. Amplitude. See what's going on there, right? Pulse width, bring the filter up, which is this one, and so on. I feel like we have lost, let me just, yeah, we lost the amplitude. For some reason, amplitude disappeared. So let's do amplitude again. There we go. I must have pressed another button somewhere. There we go. So you can see the controllers are basically 32, 33, 34, and 35. We do gain and pan. We can do the delays, which can give us either the delay amount, which is probably quite good to have. So let's try that. So that's going to be on the fifth fader. So no delay. Roughly about 50%. Let's try delay feedback. So I'm going to do that on the sixth fader. There we go. So filtering will affect what we're hearing in terms of the amount of delay. Certainly the repeats. So that's with no feedback. It's feedback at 50%. About 75. So we've got a fair amount of control there. The ones I really like looking at are things like how to control some of the probabilities of the sequencer. So let's get back up to here. So for those sorts of probabilities, we kind of have to decide whether it's and this is really where the interface is really important, because for us, when we're moving a slider, we don't really know what the scale mode is. So these ones are quite difficult to kind of hit with any form of accuracy, because you can't rearrange, at least as far as I can tell. Let me just reposition this. You can't really rearrange the scale mapping table in terms of the order that they come in at, and it's not necessarily a flaw, but really it might be nice to be able to just highlight 3 or 4 that you might actually move through. Probably better are things like root notes. Again, we have no visual feedback, so it can only be our ears that are going to help us here. And then probability. So let's try probability, because that's an easier one to do. This is on slider 7. So that's with the fader all the way down, so there's no probability of an event happening. And this is about a quarter of the way through. %. About 75. And then 100%. So we have that. So I'm just going to do root note, but I don't think that it's necessarily the most helpful thing, as you can tell. It'd be nice to be able to have specify a set of, I suppose, transposition points would be really good. This is where we can do a bit of work and sort of limit, or at least try and sort of get a sense of how to scale the output. So we can see the readout at the top there. So at the moment, that's giving us D#4. So let's say about 60 here. That gives us C3. So 58 gives us B flat, A sharp. So if we swap over to 127 to 72, that's better. So now it gives us the span of about, put the probability back up. So that's F, so that's roughly halfway, slightly over halfway. I think I'll make that base point 60. I always like the notes below, bringing those in as well. So this is probably the most difficult part, because you're going to have to try and work out physically where a fader should be set. Might be something you want to work with. I mean, personally, it's those sorts of things that you actually want to have a readout for. You want to have that kind of interface. I'm doing a little bit of Sonic Pi at the moment, like a bit of live coding. So in my versions of Awake in the Sonic Pi environment, you get a bit more control over the sorts of scales, key centers that you might use. So worth kind of looking at those. Not necessarily my coding, but actually go and have a look at Sonic Pi and see how that might work out for you. So what we have now is basically some parts that are mapped. We haven't done anything with the steps, so we can still move steps around. Whilst changing probability. Changing the filtering. So it's filtering all the way up. Changing the pulse width. Changing the release. The delay balance. The delay repeats. Probability and root note. I feel that's going to be much more left to chance. In a performance, that one's going to be a dangerous moment. The keys are very funny. Mapping is really quite straightforward on the Norns system. It's not difficult at all, and controllers, whether faders or knobs or a mixture of both, you'll find absolutely no problems in getting them to work. And as you can see from the edit page, the controllers allow you to at least do some of the scaling of the values that are there. Not everything is going to, well, depending on what controller you're using, not everything is going to correspond 100% one-to-one, but for most things, seems to work really well. All right, thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and see you next time.